Studies and Planning, and along with Rob Bertini, sitting back there and from Civil Engineering, we co-organized this weekly seminar. And we are happy today to have an encore performance from Mia Birk.
Thank you.
Last quarter, and today she's specifically going to be talking about Rails with Trails. And then I also wanted to make the announcement that this upcoming fall quarter, Mia will be teaching a bicycle and pedestrian planning class. I believe it's going to be on...
Some of you are going to be there?
I hope so. Yeah, we hope for a big turnout. If you're not currently a PSU student, you can enroll in PSU classes. So we encourage people from the community to take the class as well. I think it's going to be Monday nights.
Yeah.
Roughly, I think it's 6:40 to 9.
We're going to have Monday Night Football going in the corner.
So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mia, and I'll hand around the sign-in sheet for the students involved.
Okay, some of you, thank you. Thank you again for hosting me. Some of you I recognized some faces from last quarter, so let me just quickly tell you who I am. I'm a professional in the pedestrian and bicycle planning, design, and implementation field. I've been in this field for my entire career, which has been, it's like, gosh, it's getting into decades. It's almost 15 years now. Starting to think in decades is kind of scaring me a little bit. I had my graduate degree is in international relations with a focus on energy and the environment. And then I was 4 years in Washington, D.C., and I worked for an international organization, and we did energy conservation work in developing country cities focused on transportation. That was my specialty. Did that for 4 years. And then I came to Portland in 1993. It's been 10 years. And I was the bicycle program manager for the city of Portland for 6 years for the transportation department during the 90s. That's what I talked about last quarter, and talked about the work that Portland has done to make the city more bicycle friendly. And then for the last 4 years, I've been working as a consultant. I have a small consulting firm in town, and we do pedestrian, bicycle, and trail planning and design all over the country, and a lot of work in this region. And it's one of the projects that I'll talk to you about today is the national study that we've been doing on trails next to active railway lines. And before I get started, how many of you are students here? And how many we have guests that work for the Parks Bureau? And you work for the city, right? For? Visiting. Oh, okay. Welcome. We have one consultant. Anybody else visiting here that's TriMet? Oh, okay. Great. And you're pointing to? Okay. Which firm do you work for? CETA. Okay. Great. So this project, and can everybody see it? Do we need to turn down the lights a little bit to be able to see this? It's just this light over here. Okay. Kind of dark in the back? Yeah, there you go. Okay, so I should tell you that this is a study that's about to be published, and the federal government's been saying that for a year, so it's really about to be published. That's what they say. And it's the draft, which is like 99% similar to what the final is going to say, is on our website, www.altaplanning.com. Alta is A-L-T-A planning, all one word, .com. And you can go to, there's several different ways you can get to featured projects, Rails with Trails, or you can go to our area focus section and get to Rails with Trails, and the report's up there in a PDF format. And it's, like I said, there's a few minor tweaks that their lawyers, when they got a hold of it, started tweaking, but it's mostly intact. So this was a 4-year study of trails next to active railway lines. So let me go through the components of the study here for you, and feel free. Let's see, we've got an hour and 15 minutes, so I'll let you start breaking in and asking questions. And then I want to, at the end, if we have a little time, tell you about a project in Southern California next to an extremely high-speed rail line that's going forward, and our involvement in that. It's really quite an interesting technical question. So this is about trains, and this is also about people. And so that's why this is, to me, this has been an absolutely fascinating topic. Going just beyond the realm. I'm not going to talk about rail to trail conversions. And that's really how this movement got started, was the Rails to Trails Conservancy looked at abandoned railway lines and started rail banking those and turning them into trails. And there's literally, thousands of miles of rails to trails, including the wonderful Springwater Corridor here in Portland. But this is about trails next to active railway lines where the trains are still running. And that's a whole entirely, completely different ball of wax when you have an operating train. So this report is really synthesizing everything to do with Rails with Trails. We're looking at policies, planning. We're looking at all kinds of legal issues. That's a humongous issue for railroads, legal liability issues. We're looking at design, all the issues related to design and best practices, and we're looking at operations and maintenance. So we're looking at all of the different issues and related to Rails with Trails. And I should say that part of our mission, we were hired as a consultant team. We had railroad experts on our team. We had trail folks on our team. We had a whole sort of consortium of folks involved, and we had an active committee of railroad folks and trail folks and everybody in between. And our mission was to develop a balanced approach that really clearly represented all the interests. So this is not an advocacy report that promotes trails on active railway lines, nor does it discourage trails on railway lines. It's instead laying out all the issues and the lessons that we've learned throughout the history of developing Rails with Trails today. So the process involved reviewing existing literature, an in-depth analysis of 18 existing Rails with Trails, and there are over 70 in the country today. We've specifically analyzed 18. We did interviews with all the major railroad companies in the country, as well as many minor ones. I went to a whole lot of railroad conferences and talked to folks at those conferences. We had draft reports that were reviewed, and I had a stack of comments like this high at the end. It was amazing. A lot of research into design practices. We had a specific legal symposium with all the Class 1 railroad lawyers and many transit agency lawyers in the country together to talk about the legal issues. And we did a lot of really specific outreach to railroad folks and trail folks around the country. The final report, July 1st, 2002. We missed the deadline. We didn't miss the deadline. The federal government missed the deadline. Okay, so this is some of the specific case study research. So let me tell you where this project came from. There are, like I said, now it's up to about 70 Rails with Trails in the country today, and there are at least 80 or 90 or 100 in the planning stages. It's hard to tell how many there are exactly, but certainly what's been happening is that as we've running out of the rail to trail projects, and communities are still working to build trails, they're looking at the active railway lines and they're thinking, this is a possible place for them. These are the locations of a lot of the existing ones. It doesn't even show, this map is a little out of date, it doesn't show the one that we have in Portland, which is the Springwater-Omsey Trail. From Omsey down to Selwood is an active railroad trail. It opened in November 2002, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. We also have the Steel Bridge Riverwalk here in Portland, which was 10 years in the making, which is just a small piece, but a very critical piece. And then there's a piece of trail next to the MAX line, to the airport MAX line on I-205 that runs right next to the train. So we have three sort of railroad trail components in the Portland area. And what I wanted to show you on this was, let's see if I can get this arrow, is that there are a number of potential rail with trail in the Portland area. There's a lot of interest. There's somebody here in the last quarter, the I-84 guy, right? You, okay. So potential for a trail along the mainline corridor along I-84, tough project technically. Then there's the potential, which will be studied next year, of the rail with trail along the river next to the Lake Oswego trolley line, also a challenging one. There's a really neat project in Lake Oswego potentially to have a trail next to an active railway line that runs the whole length of Lake Oswego and out to the neighboring Tigard and Durham. Then there's talk of a Washington County commuter rail, but there's not very much interest in having a trail as part of that at this time. Then up in Vancouver, there's a mainline Amtrak line that there's interest in having a railway trail there. There's probably more in this region that I'm not aware of. Oh, there's some out in Gresham. There's interest in having a trail next to part of the MAX line out there for access. So there's a number of potential railroad trail projects in this area. But all over the country, we're seeing a lot of interest in Rails with Trails. Now, from the railroad perspective, the railroads were here first. When they came here first, they picked the very best land, the flat land, the scenic land, and the cities grew around them. The railroads literally bisect cities all over the country today. Railroad corridors are typically not fenced through communities, and they often bisect neighborhoods. We often have a love-hate relationship in communities with railroads. We have a nostalgic view of railroads from, sort of the Mark Twain era of people walking on the tracks. And then we also hate railroads because they're kind of industrial looking, and they're loud when they toot their horns as they come through neighborhoods, and there's environmental issues, and particularly the Class 1 railroad companies are not particularly tuned into the community. They tend to be, they're located in Iowa or something, and their headquarters, and they're not really part of the community. Now, there's a lot of short line railroads and transit agencies that are much more tuned into the community, so there's kind of a real mixture of things going on. And despite the fact that the railroads really, truly have made an effort in many, many places to, in terms of safety, in terms of keeping people off the tracks and keeping people out of harm's way when it comes to moving trains, people are all over the tracks. I mean, trespassing is a huge issue with railroads, and if you are on the tracks, you are trespassing. The law is extremely clear on this point. But it's very hard for the police or for the railroads who have their own security systems to police every single mile of railroad all the time. And what happens is that people get hurt. People get hurt by trains a lot, and the railroads are frequently held liable for that, even in really egregious, ridiculous cases where the drunk pedestrian laid down on the tracks to commit suicide. The person's family feels, emotionally goes and sues the railroad, and the railroads frequently and either end up settling or lose in court. And they've had really a lot of bad examples, and so they're extremely conservative legally. The railroads are. So, and in some places, trespassing and vandalism are really significant problems. The Springwater-Omsey Trail, before it was built, there was a humongous trespassing problem there. I mean, a lot of people walking up and down the tracks, and it's for a logical reason. This is the planned coastal rail trail in Southern California. People, a lot of times the railroads are in between where people are and where they want to go. And so people cross the tracks, and they walk along the tracks as they were doing in the Springwater and the Oaks Bottom area particularly. It was those two that we studied, the coastal rail trail and the Springwater-Omsey, had an incredible volume of trespassing going on. So I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. And vandalism is also a problem, and this cost the railroad a lot of money over the years. Now, from the railroad perspective, they truly think it's insane a lot of times. Not all of them, but a lot of them think it's crazy that you would come to them and say that you want to put a trail next to a moving train. And the reason, why would you want to do that? Well, there's when a trail planner is looking at a railroad corridor, they're seeing a lot of times it's flat. It's pretty wide in a lot of cases. Railroads a lot of times have 200 feet of available space, and their tracks only take up 30 or 40 feet. They've got a lot of space. Not always. I mean, there's definitely different situations. They a lot of times have the most pleasant view, though. They took the land right next to the river, and that's a big reason why trail planners. And then the other reason is that when trail planners look at what their options are in communities for making community pedestrian and bicycle friendly, their options are usually something like this in a lot of cases, a very high-speed roadway where they're going to, maybe they could put bike lanes on the road, but it still is not going to be nearly as pleasant as having a separated trail. So that's a lot of what communities are looking at. And in addition, there are about 65, 70 existing rails with trails in this country, and most of these appear to be operating with little or no problem. The Rails to Trails Conservancy put out a number of reports in the 90s that documented, they went and interviewed trail managers for a lot of the corridors, and the trail managers all said there was no problem. And the railroads absolutely hate this report. They think that it's completely biased and inaccurate. But the existing rails with trails do appear to operate with very few problems. So that's one issue. Now, from the railroad perspective, this is a privately owned piece of land in most cases. It is their place of work. They're trying to do business. They have very little interest in having what they perceive as recreational activities next to their place of business, which in their mind increases their costs, increases their liability. This is the Harper's Ferry. This trail on the left side, if you're looking at it, was a track that was converted. It's kind of interesting bridge case. And then from the railroad perspective, trains are involved in injuring a lot of people every year, and it costs them a lot of money. So it's really about business. It's about business, it's about money, it's about safety, and all those things come into play. And what we did when we interviewed all the railroads is we found that they frequently have their initial opinion, their knee-jerk opinion is, you shouldn't allow them, you shouldn't allow recreational uses next to a railroad trail. This is going to be a railroad trail corridor here as well. This is partly built already now. Okay, so let's look at some of the recommendations that we came out with in this study after doing all this analysis of all these rails with trails. And I should say we also looked at rails with trails in Australia. There's in the state of Perth in Australia, there's a whole network of rails with trails. We worked with an Australian consultant and looked very closely at those. We looked at rails with trails all over Europe, and we worked with the Canadian Pacific and Canadian National Railways on rails with trails in Canada. And there's quite a lot of information out there. So some of the things that we looked at are when you're in a master planning process, we recommend that trail planners look at all reasonable alternatives, not just to knee-jerk put the railroad corridor on the plan without having looked at whether it's remotely within the possibility. That's what railroads have found for a lot of years, is that the trail planner comes to them after they've already put it on a master plan, which has been adopted, and they've gone and gotten funding, and they've done some preliminary design work, and then they come to the railroad and say, we've got this trail plan that we want you to bless, and we just need an easement from you on your property. And the railroads don't take kindly to that. They would rather be involved up front, and they'd rather have the trail analysis really look at alternatives. We do think that almost every rail with trail project needs to have feasibility analysis done on whether, looking at all the specific issues, technical issues and legal issues related to the design and operation of a trail next to an active railway line. It's really fundamentally different than just a plain old trail, which doesn't have an active train. And I'll give you some examples of feasibility studies. This is one in Northern California in Cupertino. This is on Union Pacific tracks, and it's on Union Pacific right-of-way. They've been involved for a lot of years. They're not very happy about it. The city of Cupertino has been pushing it for a lot of years. It's partly feasible. There's parts of it that will work fine. There's plenty of width. And there's parts of it that look like this, where the trail would have to go through a single-track tunnel or obviously go around a single-track tunnel. And parts of this are really not feasible, and we'll have to divert to other surface streets or wait until such time as the city can either buy the right-of-way or the train operation discontinues. But it is a low-frequency and a low-speed train operation, so there's not as many safety issues as when you are in a high-speed corridor. Another example is it's in Maryland, Indian Head. This is considered to be feasible from a technical standpoint. It's flat. There's lots of space. Very low frequency. The only issue here is environmental issues related to the wetlands that are part of this, and that is important in every trail, is to looking at for the most environmentally sensitive planning. And there are some parts of this that would potentially be on boardwalks or have to divert to some other place. And then there was another one that we did. I don't think I have a picture of it. That's on a Union Pacific rail line going from Davis, California, to Dixon, which was just really, we found that it's just not feasible. It was the railroad had plans to have double and triple tracks on the corridor, and there was just not going to be any available space. And there was a good alternative corridor. So as part of the process, we recommend involving railroads throughout the process. Some of the things that we heard were that trail planners often look at a corridor today as a snapshot and say, well, there's lots of space, so you should be able to put a trail here. And the railroads are looking at things for 50 years. They're going, well, we're planning to double and triple track. We've got plans to expand our business. We're planning on selling that land for a variety of reasons. They have plans. This is their corridor, and that it's really important to recognize that what we see now isn't necessarily what the railroad has planned for the future, and to work with the railroad on that. And the other thing that we learned specifically from the national railroad companies called Class 1 railroads is that they're very formal operation, and you really have to be in it for the long haul if you want to do your I-84 corridor. You got to be in it for the long haul, and you're doing that. You start now, and you're looking at 10 years before maybe you could have something built. And that's a very formal structure in these companies. You can't just, here we could work directly on the Springwater-Omsey with Dick Samuels. We had a person. He's here. He lives here. He's difficult to work with, but he's one person. At the railroad, working with the Union Pacific is, working with hundreds of people, lawyers involved. What? Nebraska, in Omaha, Nebraska. So there's that. In terms of the process, and we did find that, not surprisingly, the larger companies, the Class 1 railroads, are significantly less supportive than the local companies or the transit-based companies for a variety of reasons. But I'll tell you at the same time that every Class 1 railroad has at least one example of a railway trail that they have allowed. And many of them have more. There are about 10 or 12 on Union Pacific property. There's a bunch on BNSF properties. And pretty much all of the Class 1 railroads have. And then actually the Canadian Pacific Railway is pretty active in encouraging rails with trails on their properties. So there are a lot of examples out there. And they're kind of hard fought, but there are examples. And then there's also lots of examples but I tell you, most of the rails with trails are on relatively lower speed and lower frequency. There are really no examples out there in this country of ones that are along extremely high-speed corridors yet, although there's one being built in New England and the one in Southern California. So I'll talk about that in a second. But I should say that many rails with trails are quite contentious, but that in a lot of cases we did find that there was common ground, and I'll tell you about some of that in a little bit. Some of the common ground is that there are potential benefits to the railroads, and some of the things that we found in interviewing them is money, financial compensation. A lot of times the government agency purchases the land, purchases the easement, or provides ongoing maintenance money. And one good example is the Steel Bridge Riverwalk here. Have you guys all been on the steel bridge, the lower deck? The cantilevered trail is new. And that, the city of Portland essentially is paying for the operations and maintenance costs of the trail, but that basically pays for the operation and maintenance of the Steel Bridge Riverwalk itself, of the steel bridge structure for the railroad. And they've taken on the responsibility of paying for that for a number of reasons, probably good reasons, but it's cost the city a lot of money. And the city is also paying for is assuming all liability responsibility in the case of anything that happens. And that's kind of a big deal, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Some of the other benefits to the railroad, we've seen a lot of examples of reduced trespassing, reduced vandalism, reduced dumping. We tend to see that the trail, and there's certain things, like on Springwater Omsey, people were walking along the tracks or across the tracks because they wanted to get somewhere. So when you put the trail next to it, then people walk on the trail, and they don't walk on the tracks. They don't cross the tracks if you have designated crossings. So we have reduced trespassing, and we see that a lot. And we also see that on corridors like that, because now somebody's maintaining it, somebody's managing it, you've got a lot of people out there, you've got a lot of eyes on the corridor. We tend to see a reduction in dumping and in petty vandalism and petty crime and homeless activity and a lot of the stuff that made these corridors undesirable in the first place. It tends to improve the overall aesthetic of the community as part of it. There's a number of other reasons and other positive things, too. So we recommended a number of things. The trail developers should coordinate with the railroads, obviously, work closely with the railroads. And the railroad companies, we recommended that they develop more of an internal process for how they deal with these. They tend to just, every time, kind of be shocked and not know how to organize themselves, and they stall for a number of years, and then they assign someone, and it just takes a really long time. And so we suggested, well, instead of reinventing the wheel, you could have an internal process, an internal team that could work on every one of these. And we recommended a process in that. Okay, any questions about that part before we move on to the law? Yes?
Could you use the microphone?
Yes. Question is, there seems to be a big consideration is the amount of traffic and type of railroad. You seem to be saying that the branch lines are much more feasible than our main line operations. And does that bring to bear some kind of more general policy that about branch lines as being higher priority?
For who would have for a policy that the railroads might have, you mean, or that the cities might have?
Both.
The federal government might have? No, what we concluded in the report, working with the railroads on the project, was that every single operation has to be decided in and of themselves, that there wasn't a general policy about what was more feasible or what was not as feasible, because there were examples in almost every case. It turns out that many of the main lines, certainly the higher speed, higher frequency operations, tend to be less feasible. But there wasn't, the federal government decided as part of this not to adopt a blanket policy. In fact, this process started with the Coastal Rail Trail in Southern California, there being a really active push to put a trail next to the high-speed line down there, 1996. And the railroad went to the Federal Railroad Administration and said, we want you to adopt a blanket policy that outlaws all rails with trails. And as a result of that, they had developed a committee of folks that started this process of looking at existing rails with trails. And that project is still being fought, which hopefully we'll have time to discuss. But I think each one needs to be analyzed to see what their specific issues are.
Could you use the microphone?
There is no microphone. Lean forward.
Hello. So, with the responsibility of the city taking on the burden of all the accidents, is that only for a short time, or is that over a long period? I mean, do they say up front that it's going to be for 5 years or for 10?
The city of Portland took on the responsibility for as long as the Riverwalk is in existence. And they have to pay. That means that the city pays for a supplemental insurance policy to cover the railroad's legal costs and assumes the liability for all potential things that might happen. And let me describe the legal issues. The railroad, the main concerns that they have, why would they be concerned about this? They are concerned about who is a trail user. Are they a trespasser or are they a trail user? And is a trespasser in the law considered to be, is a trail user on our corridor? If I invite someone onto my corridor, do they become, where am I legally responsible or not? right now, certainly if you are on a railroad corridor, you are trespassing. There's no question. But there is a question of if you invite people onto your corridor, then it's a different legal definition. So that's one of their concerns. They are concerned about increasing trespassing incidents. If all of a sudden you have a lot more people in proximity to their tracks, is that an attractive nuisance? More people are around. They are concerned about potential injuries to trail users, and they're concerned about legal defense costs. And let me talk about the laws. Well, some of the recommendations. First of all, if you're going to do a railroad trail, is to initiate legal research very early in the process. Who owns the property? Is it owned by the railroad, or is it owned by, a lot of times the land is owned by somebody else and the railroad leases the land. Who owns the land, and what are the state laws related to trespassing, and what are the state laws related to, there are a number of states that have laws related to trails that if a property owner allows a trail on their corridor, they're absolved of legal responsibility. The government assumes that responsibility. So there's a lot of legal issues that need to be kind of like a legal analysis right up front is a really important component. The trail agency, the best way to work with the railroads is for them to acquire the property, because as soon as the government agency acquires the railroad property, they assume the legal responsibility, and it doesn't become a railroad responsibility. So, that doesn't always work, but in the case of Springwater-Omsey, that is what happened. The Metro government acquired the land and leases it back to the railroad, and so there's not a legal question there, so that works better. Using best design treatments that are available. There is not like a manual that says this is how you design a railroad trail. There's a whole compilation of stuff out there, and that's a way to have legal protection. And another thing that can happen is to work to strengthen the state laws to reduce the burden of liability that might be occurring on the railroad. And in the case of the Steel Bridge and others, depending on how much the government agency wants the trail and how the legal situation is set up, the government agency may have to assume the legal responsibility for things that happen. And then I should say the last one was about insurance. The railroad, even if the city assumes, the government agency assumes the legal responsibility, or the state statute is really, really strong, the railroad company may still have to incur legal costs because you, as a trail user, could sue. We can all sue anybody for whatever we want to, and there's a certain point at which the judge might throw it out. But in the meantime, they may have incurred $100,000 in legal costs. And one of the things is that there is insurance that can be taken out to cover those legal costs, and the railroads don't want to bear that responsibility. Certainly the Class 1s don't, and the short lines, the small guys, the small operators, that could put them out of business. So that's one of the key issues. Now let's talk about the protections that are available. There are 49 states that have something called a recreational use statute, and that is a state statute. The federal government provided an example about 10 years ago of what a recreational use statute was supposed to look like, and every state adopted some version of it. And it basically says that if you, the whole intent of it was to encourage private landowners to open up their space for trail development. And so it says that if you allow recreational uses on your property, that you are absolved, that you are not responsible for the trail user getting hurt on the trail. Now, if you accept that, and there's always exceptions, if you place a large piece of jagged metal in the trail, then of course the landowner may still be held responsible. Or if the landowner failed to provide adequate warning about a nuisance, they may be held responsible. But for your basic operation of the trail users on the trail, the owner is not held responsible. And if the trail user leaves the corridor and goes onto the private property, breaks through the fence or decides that they want to go wander around the siding, then the railroad owner is not held responsible for that. So that's a really key thing that's in every state. And a lot of times when I've gone to railroad conferences and said, are you aware that your statute says this? We have a whole compendium in the report of the number of every single one of these. They say, oh, I had no idea. And their lawyers don't even know that these laws exist. So that's kind of a big thing. There's trespassing statutes in all states. They're not very well enforced, and some of them are stronger than others, so that they can be strengthened. There's about 20 states that go even further. They have very specific legislation that says that when a case of trail use, that adjacent property owners are not responsible for trail users that injure themselves on the trail or get injured. California has a very strong one as a good model for this country. There's also in the agreements between the government agency and the railroad, there's ways to craft those in terms of who's legally responsible. And then there's insurance and transfer of ownership. 95% of existing rails with trails are insured essentially through the trail management agency, through umbrella policies. They don't have a specific insurance policy for that trail. They just have their general governmental insurance policies, and that has been working. About half the trails have specific indemnification agreements. Indemnification means that they shoulder all of the legal responsibility. They absolve the railroad of legal responsibility. But many of them have exceptions, and this is one thing the railroad agencies don't like, is that there's exceptions. And the exceptions are almost always in the case that they use the words egregious or wanton, reckless. They use these kinds of words. And what that means is that if a train derails, leaves its tracks, and hits the people that are on the trail or in the park or the sidewalk or whatever's next to the tracks, that the railroad will be held responsible. And that is a very big concern for the railroads because trains do derail. Quite a few derail. In fact, far more than we think. We only hear in the paper about the really, really big derailments, but we don't hear about all the little ones that occur pretty much on a daily basis. There's some kind of derailment, and people do get hurt. And the railroads are very concerned about shouldering legal responsibility for derailments. And in almost every legal case, they are held responsible for derailments. Now, in the case of the Steel Bridge Riverwalk, the City of Portland went one step further than most agencies ever have, and they shoulder responsibility if there's a derailment. The City of Portland will pay for the legal costs to anybody that's injured on the trail. And that's a big deal. But you got to look at the railroad's perspective. Those people were not there before. Before the trail went in, there were no people there other than a few trespassers that were walking on the tracks. Now there are literally thousands and thousands of people there. And so who should bear that responsibility? And the City of Portland decided, I mean, the railroad said right from the beginning, you will bear this responsibility if you want to have this here, and the City of Portland decided to do that. So that's a big thing. That's a big thing. And there have been only a few cases that have tested this in the courts, but the legal protections have held in those cases. And so that's a positive thing from a railroad perspective. Okay, now on the design side, there are a whole lot of design issues. There's just everything you can figure out, just your basic trail design, there's a lot of issues. Then you introduce a railroad in there. I'm going to distill it down to the three main issues that come up over and over and over again. One, the setback distance. How far is the trail from the tracks? This is obviously a very important issue for the railroads. The second is separation technique. Will there be a fence? Will there be a wall? Will there be a ditch? How will we prevent people from leaving the trail and going over to the tracks? And the third big issue, which is the most important safety issue, is crossings, where the trails cross the tracks. That's a huge issue. Railroads would prefer the trails never to cross the tracks. So that is an issue. And there are a lot of other issues. And our report has diagrams for every single one of these things. And what I find is that the devil's in the details. When you get right down to designing a trail, you've got this very specific situation, and the little diagram doesn't exactly apply to this situation, then you get into a lot of issues. And each one of those takes time to work through. Let's talk about the setback. Talk about our recommendations. We recommended that on setback that really we really went through a very lengthy process with the railroads related to setback. And there was, at various times in there, an attempt to have very specific setback recommendations. If the train goes at this speed and it's this frequent, then the setback should be 25 feet. If it goes at this speed, it can be 10 feet, or maybe it has to be 50 feet. I mean, we had very specific in there. And in the end, where we ended up was that every case is different, and every case has to be analyzed in and of itself, and that we don't have specific recommendations in there for the actual number. We have a lot of examples. We have a range. They're typically, 8.5 feet is the absolute bare minimum because that's the Public Utilities Commission's requirements for fixed objects must be that far away from the center line of the track. That's the bare minimum, and I think we have that on the Springwater OMSI. But in most cases, the railroads want to get 25 feet or more. On the Coastal Rail Trail in Southern California, they want to get 50 feet back from the track. Providing fencing and separation, it's kind of a mixed thing. Fencing is good because it channelizes people, keeps them off the railroad for the most part. But people can break through fences. They can climb over fences. They vandalize fences. It's very expensive to maintain fences. It's not like a guarantee. There's other separation techniques that may be better. There's vertical separation. There's drainage swales are a good way to keep people out. There's walls. There's vegetative buffers that tend to do just as good of a job as fences do. And but in most cases, the railroads want them, and the trail agency doesn't want to pay for it. So it's kind of an issue that comes out as part of that. But if it's on railroad property, you really don't have much choice. If the railroad wants there to be a fence and it's on railroad property, you have to put in the fence. If it's on government property and the railroad's leasing it, then there's more wiggle room. At-grade crossings is a huge issue. The railroads, the Federal Railroad Administration has been very aggressive at closing at-grade crossings in this country. They're trying to close them for safety reasons. They close motor vehicle crossings. They close pedestrian crossings. They work hard to close crossings in communities. They're very proud of themselves. The railroads themselves, they go around to railroad conferences. They give presentations on how they close this many every year. And so in the meantime, the trail folks come around and they want to add an at-grade crossing. The railroads don't like that at all. The Federal Railroad Administration doesn't like it. So a good practice in this is to minimize at-grade railroad crossings or use existing at-grade railroad crossings or develop over or under crossings or try to close other crossings as a trade-off for the new one that goes in. So railroad crossings are a big issue. Including utilities in the corridor. There's a lot of issues related to utilities, and I'm not going to talk to that too much. And trestles and bridges are another big issue, is that, if you have to use them, it's a big issue if you have to go over a railroad bridge or a trestle. And so you have to carefully analyze those. And going through single-track tunnels is pretty much a no-no. Don't go through a single-track tunnel if you can. There's almost no way that you're going to get your trail built if you have to go through a single-track tunnel. And then environmental impacts. Okay, so now I just want to kind of buzz through some examples here. We found that with proper planning, well-designed trails do tend to keep people off the tracks. They tend to be a good way to reduce trespassing and move people away from the tracks. And that, a corridor like this is a good example. Over half of the existing rails with trails are on basically mainline trains right now. Some of them are mainline and some of them are passenger. The rest are on transit or short line. There's a huge variance in train speed. There's very low-speed trains, 5 miles an hour, 8 miles an hour. There's even in Europe mostly, and in Australia, there's very high-speed trains. And then the Coastal Rail Trail and the Northeast Corridor in New England will soon have over 120-mile-an-hour trains with a trail next to it. And there is one. There's a couple of other examples of high-speed rail in this country, but the trails tend to be quite far away from the tracks. There's quite a lot of diversity in where the trails are located, some industrial, some rural, some urban, and a lot of different types of trains. The average setback is about 33 feet, but there's a considerable range as well. Okay, I don't think I have time for all this. The trail setback should be correlated to the speed of the train, the frequency of the train, the site conditions, the type of train, site distance, and in almost every case there has to be engineering and engineering analysis done and judgment involved in that. This is the Stavage Trail in Ohio. This is the Springwater Corridor in Portland, which is the before picture of the Springwater Corridor. I don't have the after picture, but these are the kind of extremes. This one is very close to 10 feet from the edge of the track, from the center line of the track to the edge of the trail. And it's working quite nicely, and it's gotten trespassers off the tracks. This is Steel Bridge Riverwalk, also about 10 feet away from the center line of the tracks. This is a trail in Kirkland, Washington that's proposed, and there really isn't any room. In some cases, it may not be feasible because there simply isn't enough room. Separation. There's vertical separation. This will be part of the Coastal Rail Trail. Not too big of an issue related to concerns there. There's horizontal separation. This is a very high-speed rail in Wisconsin, and the trail is about 100 feet. So it's separated by all this vegetation as well as distance. There's all different kinds of fencing, and the railroads typically do want to see fencing. There's wrought iron fencing down in the corner. There's your wood rail fencing, which doesn't really provide much of a deterrent, but it's sort of a channelization kind of thing. Then there's your typical chain link fence. Okay, so that's separation. Let me talk about crossings. It's the area of greatest concerns, as I said. This is what I heard over and over and over again throughout the process. That section of the report was the most pored over, the most attacked, the most vilified, and in the end is probably the strongest because so many people were involved in ensuring that there are safe and well-designed crossings as part of trail projects. A lot of existing trails have very simple railroad crossings like this. People cross the tracks. They have a crossing, there's warning signs, and that's it. There's nothing really too aggressive about it, and they have been working pretty well. There are some that have more active warning devices. There are gates, there are lights, and we talk about that in the report as when you would want to bump up to the next threshold of. Then there's above-grade crossings, which there's a number of good examples out there. They can be obviously extremely expensive to build. You have to meet ADA, so you have to get above the tracks. You have to have a very high clearance of the railroad, of trains, which can be very, very high. And the question of whether people will use them, they have to be well designed and be obviously very well integrated into the trail system or people won't use them. Then there are a number of good undercrossings, and like every proposed tunnel or undercrossing, you've got safety concerns, you've got concerns about whether people will use them, whether they're going to be dark and scary places, or whether they're going to be well designed. There's a few really good examples that are well designed. This one down on the lower right is in, let's see, this is in Vancouver, Washington, as part of the Discovery Loop. So you can see that. It's a really nice undercrossing of a railroad track. The Platte River Trail in Colorado and the Tony Knowles Coastal Trail in Anchorage, which is a really impressive trail system up there. Then we talk a lot about bridges and how to design bridges. There are a couple of examples of cantilevering something onto a bridge or taking a single track and turning it into a part of a trail component. But in general, the railroads are mostly opposed to having anything hung off the side of their bridges or turned into a trail bridge. But there are examples out there of creative ways. But here's one example on the left where if you encounter this in your project, it might be a fatal flaw. Or you might have to build a new bridge. Okay, I'm going to go through this. Your system is low on memory. Okay, a little bit on operations and maintenance. I'm just going to skip that. On operations and maintenance side, I'll just quickly say that we found, when I went to a lot of railroad conferences, what I frequently find is that the train engineers are involved at railroad conferences, particularly Operation Lifesaver. They have this very aggressive program that they have developed in and of themselves. It's an education program. You may have heard of it. It's Stop, Look, and Listen. It's all about, they go to the schools and they try to get kids to not cross the tracks, not walk on the tracks. It's funded through the railroad industry. And it is primarily, it's all volunteer time of railroad personnel. And it's like, what happens is that the people who operate the trains, typically in their lives, have killed someone. And so they would come up to me at a conference and they would say, I can't believe that you would want to put trail users in my corridor. I see people all the time on our tracks, and I killed one, or I almost killed one, and it's an incredibly scarring experience for a train operator to absolutely, they are completely out of control. They cannot stop that train, in most cases, to avoid killing that person. And it's a lot of times it's suicides, but they personally are scarred for life by doing this. And we have to be, I think, a really successful railroad trail project reaches out to those individuals and talks to them about what they're seeing on the corridor. I went on a project in Northern California that's in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it goes along a curve. And what happened on that project was I talked to, we were a consulting team, and we talked to the Parks Department, and they said, oh, this is a great project. We're very excited about it. And then we went to go talk to the railroad, and the railroad said, this is the absolute stupidest place in the country that you could put a trail. It's the most dangerous possible place because there are sight distance issues and there's a lot of fog when people come around the curves. And so we went out with the train operator to see where are these blind curves, where is the fog roll in, what are the issues, where are you seeing people? And that made a really big difference in the project. It's just working with the individuals that are involved, not just the lawyers at corporate headquarters, but really getting involved with the operation and signal personnel that are involved in a project. I think going out with those people and sitting in the cab and really seeing what they see at the front of the train is really important. And they have all kinds of things that they see that others don't see. And it's kind of cool to go sit in the cab and see what they see. The vast majority of railroad trail projects are maintained by the trail authorities. They assume that responsibility. The Seattle Waterfront Trail, this is a very low-speed train operation, and the signalmen actually walk in front of the train and kind of shoo people off of the tracks. And so there's that extreme of that project. And then there's this is a railroad trail in Michigan where the corridor is now maintained by a volunteer group that raises money and does that every year. And it's actually a snowmobile trail in the winter. It doesn't look like much of a trail in the summer, but it's a snowmobile trail, and they get registration fees from snowmobiles, and they use that money to patrol it. In the winter, they patrol it. They have they pay the police, and the police come out there, and the problems that they see, well, first of all, the tracks are covered in snow, so that's kind of hard. It's not always their fault, but the snowmobilers tend to be drunk. That's the main problem. So the police logs that they gave us were basically 25 citations, and 23 of them were for drunkenness, and the other 2 were for not having a license. So it's, that's kind of different issues in different parts of the country. And what we feel is important, and they did this on the City of Portland did a great job on the East Bank Esplanade, on the east side of the river, and the Springwater OMSI, developing a public safety plan, a trail safety plan. I mean, every trail project is a concern. Residents are concerned about safety. They're concerned about people in their backyards, that kind of thing. And they're concerned about the kind of activity, and they're concerned about people coming in their area and all these things. And for all trail projects, and a railwood trail project is no exception. I think a public safety plan where you look at all the issues along the trail is a really important component. Okay, the next steps for this is really just that the federal government needs to just publish this report. I don't know what's going on. It's taken them a really long time. And let me just quickly tell you about this really interesting study. You were talking about main lines. Now, in Southern California, the Coastal Rail Trail project was moving right along. And the consulting team that we're part of, a large engineering firm, developed plans. They have $20 million in funding to build the trail right next to very high-speed rail, extremely high-speed rail, on the railroad corridor. The railroad it's a transit agency that owns the railroad corridor, the North County Transit District, and they lease the tracks to Burlington Northern, so there's freight, there's high-speed passenger rail, and there's a huge, pretty big corridor. But the railroad has been involved has a memorandum of understanding that they're part of this process, that they're partnering with the cities. There's 7 cities along the way. There's a regional government agency. Everybody's moving forward with this funding. And the railroad agency last year took a look at the plans and kind of flipped out and said, wait a second, whoa, we need to develop our own design guidelines for where you can put the trail. And effectively, their guidelines killed the project. And they knew what they were doing. They wanted to kill the project. They don't like the project at all. They have no interest in having a trail on the corridor. They're very concerned about liability. And one of the things that we did as part of this was to really look very specifically at this corridor and the issues related to high-speed rail, which we didn't look at that closely in the other report. So some of the issues I'll just talk about specific to high-speed rail, because there's a lot of interest in this. As Amtrak is doing high-speed rail in this country, there's a lot of interest in whether we can have trails along high-speed rail or not, what kinds of issues. I mean, if a high-speed train derails, people are going to get killed. It's going to be pretty ugly. So I can see, in my opinion, it's very important to take this very seriously and decide whether this is appropriate or not in these corridors. Let's see, let me go forward. That's part of what it looked like. The North County Transit District operates 18 coasters, 22 Pacific Surfliners, and 48 trolley trains, and 5 freight trains weekly. There are varying speeds. We looked at the issue of setback, which was their main concern, and said that, we need to look at all these issues. Type, speed, and frequency of the trains, what kind of technique is going to be used to separate the tracks, topography, sight distance, historic problems, maintenance requirements, corridor ownership, liability assignment. The railroad was very concerned about wind debris, velocity of the train, and how that would affect people who were in close proximity to the train. And so that was an important issue that they wanted us to look at. So we looked at that as well. Some of the examples of relatively high-speed rail in the country, there was the Norwottuck Rail Trail, it's 45 miles an hour. Anacostia River Trail, it's about 70 miles an hour in this country. La Crosse River State Trail in Wisconsin, which is 80 miles an hour. The ATSF trail in Irvine does go 90 miles an hour, but the trail's pretty well separated. You don't even know it's there a lot of times. There are a number of trails next to active railway lines in Switzerland and other places. It's very interesting because when you call up there to find data, they just say, why would we have data on this? There's no problem. Or why would we have standards for this? We just do it. They just don't understand why is there a concern for something like, of course you put a trail next to a freight train. It's no problem. I mean, they just don't get why this is an issue. They don't have the legal, I think it really comes down to legal issues. They just don't have, you just don't sue the railroad company if you get injured. You just don't. So it's just different. And they have a very extensive network of rails with trails in Finland that are next to very high-speed rails. In the Northeast Corridor in New England, the trail is planned for, I don't know if it's going to be complete this summer or not, but it's going to be separated about 30 feet behind a chain link fence, and it will be 120-mile-an-hour trains. So that's a good precedent out there. And along the Coastal Rail Trail in Southern California, there are parts where first of all, there are stations. And at the stations, the train runs right through the station. And there's public sidewalks that are only 18 feet away from the trains right now. There are lots of examples of high-speed rail that go, every passenger station along a transit corridor, essentially, a lot of them are high-speed, relatively high-speed, and trains blast through there at pretty high speed. So we looked at those issues to see what those issues were. And let me get to that. This is derailments. But the issue with wind, air, and debris was an important issue for the railroad. Now, it turns out the Federal Railroad Administration has 2 very technical documents where they've analyzed the aerodynamic impacts of wind on passengers at passenger stations, and they've looked very closely at this issue, and they worked with some folks in England where they have high-speed rail blasting through stations, and they looked at the Northeast Corridor on the East Coast, and they looked at air pressure changes, the initial rush of wind as it comes by you, and then the induced airflow. The next, as it you know what I mean. If you're standing at a station and it zooms by you, there's the initial impact, and then there's the secondary impact of the wind that comes rushing through, and that can kick up track debris. And they found that basically there wasn't really much of an impact on passengers, enough of a safety concern. People weren't getting blown off the tracks. But at the same time, what happened at the Coastal Rail Trail in Southern California was that the railroads did their own little study, and they took a mannequin that weighed about 20 pounds. It was a blow-up mannequin. They put some sand in the bottom of it. They put a scarf on her. They put a hat on her, and they placed her about 10 feet and then 15 feet and then 25 feet from the tracks. And they videotaped what happened when the train blew through the corridor. And they made a little clip, they made a little video footage of this and showed it to the board of the transit district. And it showed, and over again they showed, and look at this shot, that the scarf is down the tracks. And in this one, the mannequin blew right over. And in this one, the hat, this kid would have gotten, this is representative, they said, of of your 7-year-old daughter, which, not going to weigh 30 pounds. But anyway, it was a very emotional piece, and resulted in the media down there just going on a feeding frenzy about how ridiculous this was. And they called it like the nuclear test site videos that we watched in the 50s, the mushroom cloud, the people in their little shack, and and it was really scary. That's how they felt when they watched this video is, oh my God, it's so scary. My 7-year-old daughter's going to get killed. And then you have this, then you start to think it through and you go, well, is that really what's going to happen? I mean, so what we did is we put some people out on the tracks, and we got an actual 7-year-old child, and his dad was out there, and we did videotaping of what would actually happen. We had wind meters, and we measured all this stuff, and found that there was basically no impact. At 30 feet was a drop-off point. There was impact before 30 feet. He felt a little bit of wind. He didn't blow him over. But 30 feet was kind of the breaking point to where there was literally you couldn't feel the wind at all. So we looked at that, and we recommended that the trail be located 30 feet be the setback because of that and a bunch of other factors as well. And we looked at these studies, and we called the authors of these studies, and we described our train situation, and we went through that with them, and that's what we found out. And so we did a bunch of observations, and we recommended the 30 feet. So what happened was the transit district staff that had their mannequin, they came up with, they didn't like our report at all. That's sort of an understatement. They really hated it. And they went to their board, and they recommended a 50-foot setback through the corridor. They basically said that they just have to have 50 feet. They didn't have any scientific reason. They just had to have 50 feet. And the board rejected their recommendations and said, look, there's this scientific analysis that said that 30 feet's adequate. So they're at this point trying to design the trail with a 30-foot setback, which it'll be fine. So that's that story, and that's really all I had to say about that. So every one of these projects is very interesting. They're all a little bit different, and this is what it would look like on the Coastal Rail Trail. It would be about 30 feet in this area, allow for parallel road maintenance roadway. In some areas, it would be 70 feet away, so no problem. Go ahead.
When you say 30 and 70 feet, again, you're talking from the center line of
the center line of the nearest track to the edge of the paved trail. So in that space, you could have a wall or a fence or something else. So you could, in many cases, get fairly close if you had a good separation technique. But again, it depends on all these factors, and I think it needs to be analyzed very carefully. Yes?
I used to ride the rail trail that goes along the rail from Sumner to Renton, Washington 2 or 3 days a week, and I don't remember what it's called, but it's completely separated except at some of the crossings where it does get really close.
Yeah.
But even there, I never had any problems. Do you know anything about that one? I mean, did research on that one
We
play
talked to
any
the
role?
Burlington Northern owns those tracks, and we talked to them, and no, there haven't really been any problems. And that area, they're all working on expanding the rails with trails. I mean, there really haven't been problems with any of the existing rails with trails. There are a number, we heard from some railroad folks that there are some sort of informal trails where it's like a footpath and it's pretty close to the rail, and they've seen some problems. But we didn't have, we looked at the data. We looked at the crash records for every accident that happened with a pedestrian or bike injury related to a trail in this country. We couldn't come up with any that were rail with trail related. There was one incident in Anchorage, Alaska, on the coastal rail, on the Tony Knowles coastal trail, where a boy cut through the fence that separates the trail and tried to jump onto a moving train. It was very tragic. And the railroad had an agreement with the city of Anchorage that the city would be legally responsible for anything that happened. And the railroad made the case that it was trail related, even though the boy left the trail. And the city had to pay for that case, had to pay out for that case. Then the city went back to the railroad and tried to renegotiate the agreement because that seemed a little unfair. There was one incident in Wisconsin or somewhere where a cow was injured by a train at a trail crossing. So there was that. And there's been so few incidents that we could find. We asked all the railroads to provide us any incidents that they knew about that weren't accounted for. I mean, their records are private. They don't want to reveal any, they don't just basically flat out refuse to reveal any private information about legal cases. So we weren't able to get that much information on that. So we didn't find a history out there that led us to believe that there was that trails next to active railway lines were inherently dangerous. In fact, we felt that in the end, the balance was on the fact that they provided more benefits in a whole variety of ways. Yes.
I was just wondering if you found in your research that rails with trails is more common in England, because I know that pathways and cross-throughs through private property even are much more prevalent than they are here. And I was just wondering if rails with trails are more prevalent in England.
I didn't learn that. I have a number of contacts in England, and I didn't get information from them that led me to believe that. But I did find that to be the case in Switzerland and Finland and most of Scandinavia, that it was pretty common, but not in Germany. The Germans said no. The rail is so high speed, and it goes through all these really tight mountain channels that they don't tend to do it. Australia. And I should say that most of the railroad agencies in these countries are quasi-governmental owned, so it's kind of a different environment. But Perth, Australia was the best example. The railroad agency is working with the transportation agency, and together they're actively putting a trail on every single railroad line, and they have very specific design guidelines for that, and they're aggressively doing it. So I kind of saw and that's what they have decided to do. So there are some good examples. And I found the other really interesting one is the Canadian Pacific Railway. And they come at it from a very different perspective. And again, different liability thing up in Canada. But the person that I was dealing with there was a security officer, was the chief of their security. And what they have found is that if they come in and look at security problems, they're finding that if they put the trails there on purpose, then they get rid of a lot of the problems that they were having, trespassing and vandalism and dumping. And they have, in the crime prevention world, there's this whole theory called trespassing prevention through environmental design, or crime prevention through environmental design. And the principle is that, if you have it's the brick wall, it's the broken window building theory. It's like the Rudy Giuliani theory that if you clean up the little things, then that helps clean up the big things. And so the idea of this is that if you design a corridor that previously was kind of scary and yucky, and people were doing whatever bad things they were doing, then if you clean it up and get good people on the corridor, the families and the eyes on the corridor, then those problems tend to go away. And so the Canadian Pacific Railway is actively looking for spots where they can clean up their problems by putting in trails. So they kind of have a reverse impact as we do here. And Jennifer's whispering.
Okay, so I just want to say that I think the Banfield Corridor project that I'm trying to do is political difficulties, not technical. Because they're technical, it's no problem. You should see my slideshow; it's great.
I want to see your slideshow.
So on that note, if you mentioned that politically or whatever, or technically, you got to deal with your issues of space or separation, and then in the planning process, it's bad to bring the railroads in at the last minute just to stamp it. So can you explain what are the successful ways about getting a project started and getting it through the phase? What are some stories of how the planning process was initiated?
There are some good stories. So you should look in the report in the process section. There are some good examples in there. So what I would suggest is go to the railroads and first of all, try to get money for a feasibility study, and then try to get a memorandum of agreement with the railroads that you're going to work collaboratively with them, and that you're going to respect their legal concerns and security concerns, and that you write something that really expresses the sensitivity that you have to railroad issues, and that you're going to involve them in every step of the way, and you really work kind of hand in hand with them. Now, they may just blow you off altogether, but the Union Pacific, fortunately, because they agreed to the Steel Bridge Riverwalk, there should be some contact person through the Transportation Department, through PDOT, that has the right person there, because they actually even went to the press conference when they opened the steel bridge and said, well, this is a great project, we're really proud of this, and we want to do more projects like this. This guy's like on videotape saying this, and I'm sure that his corporate headquarters people are like, oh my God, we should never have let that guy speak. But so that would be, there are some really good examples of that where they've worked with the railroad, and they basically say, we're going to respect your design considerations and other things. And you know, there is another approach, and I have to say, if I put on a hat of an advocate who's been working in trail design and advocacy for a lot of years, the other approach is to force it on the railroads, and that has worked in some communities, and some communities have just said, you know what, the railroad's not going to cooperate, and so we're just going to we're going to get the politicians, we'll get our congressman or senator to basically force them, or we'll condemn their property or whatever. I mean, it's extremely hard to do it that way. I think either way, it's going to take 10 years, but I think that working with the railroad, you're more likely to get it done, and you're more likely to get a better product out of it. You know, a trail that they can come up with solutions. They could come up with some ideas. They could say, well, in this case, you know, like on the Springwater Omsey, you know, the railroad operator was paid by the city to move his tracks, and so maybe that's something that they had in mind. Maybe they were thinking to themselves, you know, there's all kinds of things they might have been thinking about. We want to swap land. That happens a lot. We want to get this crossing closed, and as part of your process, you could get that crossing closed. Or we want the city to pay for a siding to be relocated for some reason or another. So I think that typically, if you work with the railroad, you find more solutions than you do. But it's hard. I think it'll be hard. So be in it for the long haul. Get a job and that is in this specific field, right? But if you can, I think right now, if you can get Portland to put on their list of funding needs a feasibility study, or through Metro, somebody has to start putting that on every funding document that they want money for it. Because it's, you know, the Lake Oswego trolley line, the feasibility study is going to be done starting this summer, and it's, you know, that's going to be a tough project. Because they also want to reactivate commuter rail in that area, so. Yes? Professor? I'll repeat your question. Exactly. He's already gotten it on the map, which was a big step. He had to get it on the map.
RTP.
Right. He already got it on the Metro RTP map, which is a big step. That's really great, because I tried to get it on the map 10 years ago when I worked for the city of Portland, and they were just like, you know, that'll never happen. Forget about it. It wasn't worth fighting at that time. We had so many other priorities to worry about. That's just totally not worth fighting. But now is a brilliant time to do it, and it's great that you did that. Making an impact. Students making an impact. Any other questions?
Is there ever an example where a railroad company was supportive of an at-grade crossing in areas where maybe there was high trespassing? And is there research that shows that they actually could possibly improve the safety of an area?
Yes, there are examples where the railroad was supportive of an at-grade crossing, particularly transit agencies. They tend to be supportive of at-grade crossings. You know, transit agencies kind of have a whole different way of thinking, because their goal is to get people to the train, whereas the freight companies want to get people away from the train. So it's kind of a different mindset. Also, the tourist type trains, excursion trains, tend to be supportive of getting people to the tracks. So there are those, and there are examples certainly of those that have improved the safety. I mean, there's a lot of examples. I mean, the Springwater corridor is going to have an example right there down at the end at Umatilla. That's going to be an improved crossing, probably improved safety down there. So certainly, I think a well-designed crossing can. I think I have some examples in there even of where there was some. Previously, you had a lot of trespassing going back and forth across the whole corridor, and the result of the trail project was to channelize all crossings to a few crossings that are well designed, and that reduced the safety, improved the safety aspects along the whole corridor. So yeah, there's some examples in there, and I can try to find you some other ones if you want. But I think there are some good ones out there. I thought I was finishing at 1:15, so I was going kind of fast, but it's really not done until 1:30, huh? That's okay? Additional questions, thoughts, concerns? Okay. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.
And we did have a recent person watching you on the web because
Oh.
Bill Clues said not to use a laser pointer
Oh.
because the people in Webland,
Okay.
they just get
T-
that
Can you
electronic-
reply to him and say hi and hello?
You wanna just-
He can hear me right now. Hello, Bill.
Anyone who wasn't able to sign up. No, it's so you're supposed to, well, I checked it out, but, you know, but it really is supposed to go around the entire room. It's stuck out
Thanks, Rob.
Have you seen the cattle train corridor down in the Bay Area?
Yeah.
There are a lot of places where